Of you who are here present and to those also online who have dialed in today. My name is Ambassador Edward O'Donnell. I'm a retired U.S. Ambassador, State Department, now a professor of practice at Arizona State University. And I teach about atrocity prevention and also human rights. And it was my job and role in the Genocide Awareness Week board to recruit practitioners and senior State Department officials who are promoting human rights democracy around the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Sizemore, our speaker today, who is a very distinguished senior officer. He is a civil servant, travels overseas to embassies around the world, and he is in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He also is a part of the Security and Human Rights Office and leads a team that really shapes policy for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He's also the representative to the White House on the Atrocity Prevention Task Force. His issues that he deals with on that task force are gender and women, peace and security, and all issues under that rubric of the U.S. government commitment, reflecting the will of the American people, commitment to democracy and human rights, and preventing atrocities and genocide and that horrible march to discrimination, hatred, bigotry that ends up in ethnic cleansing or mass atrocities or genocide. Jeff also is a distinguished, now retired Navy military officer and has a distinguished career as a surface warfare officer. And he has a master's degree from the National Security and Strategic Studies Naval War College, and is a graduate of George Washington University. So without further ado, Jeff Sizemore, welcome, and thanks for being here at Genocide Awareness Week.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you to Arizona State and the Genocide Awareness Week Board of Directors for inviting me to Tempe to join you all this week. I would like to thank the Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation and the Zorin Institute and all the other Genocide Awareness Week donors for their generosity in arranging this event. I'd also like to thank Professor Tim. Thank you so much for your assistance and the logistics for this as the board as a whole and your leadership and vision. I'd like to thank Dean of Humanities, Jeffrey Cohen of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Professor Turcour from the Director School of Politics and Global Studies. These events don't happen without leadership and effort on the part of those that believe that these are topics worth talking about. And so thank you very much. Lastly, thank you, Ambassador O'Donnell, for all your assistance in organizing my visit over the months that we've kind of been talking about this. Again, I am honored and so privileged to be joining you all here today. I'd like to talk to you about the means and mechanisms by which we address the most challenging of the threats to civilian security and safety in what is increasingly a fractured and challenging international landscape. From my seat in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, we are regularly promoting democracy, nurturing, and really addressing democracy and pushing it forward while combating and confronting authoritarianism and addressing those human rights abuses and threats to civilians that we find globally. As stated, I am Jeff Sizemore, and I am my Bureau's Senior Advisor on Atrocity Prevention. I am tasked with organizing and coordinating the work of my Bureau as it relates to addressing and reducing the risk of atrocities and genocide around the world. As you might imagine, that is a really, really wide focus, having a global remit, and there's sadly more risk going around than we'd like. And I simply can't function without the incredible knowledge and understanding of the various country contexts from the various desk officers in our Bureau that I am so fortunate to work with. My functional experience and my functional expertise in sort of doing and dealing with atrocity risk is useless without the insight from those that truly understand local contexts. Making decisions from DC has not always proven to be the most effective, and if we are not locally informed and locally led, our efforts often do not achieve the aims that we're looking for. From a DRL perspective, democracy, human rights, and labor, there's kind of nothing that our Bureau does that doesn't at least tangentially aid in addressing atrocity risk. If we're strengthening and supporting civil society, if we're improving rule of law, if we're encouraging free and fair elections, if we're protecting marginalized populations and those that are facing intersectional risk, if we're seeking accountability for those that commit human rights abuses or undermine democracy, reducing civilian harm, shielding children and youth, especially those in situations of armed conflict, ensuring human rights are factored into foreign assistance decisions, and really buttressing those multilateral approaches to democracy promotion. All of that ultimately drives down atrocity risk. The Bureau's work grapples with promoting and harnessing the opportunities for greater prosperity and for well-being across the globe, while also ensuring that the US government responds to the needs of the world's most vulnerable populations during their darkest times. I'm really grateful to work with my colleagues across both the functional and regional offices inside of the Bureau, working daily and tirelessly to improve the lives of people globally and improve the human rights situation in any way that they can and in any way possible. We believe staunchly that democracy is the form of government with the greatest capacity to advance peace, prosperity, and security, and to safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms. I don't have to tell you that free and fair democratic societies that respect human rights, have healthier citizens, less violence, more prosperous communities. It's also no surprise that countries with ineffective government institutions, rampant corruption, and weak rule of law have a much higher risk of internal instability and civil war. They have a higher risk of extreme communal violence. They have a higher list of criminality. It's no surprise that those that study atrocity risk dynamics as these factors are always at the top of the red flag lists as we look at sort of those international lists of those most likely to see atrocity violence. There's also a clear economic incentive for legitimate and inclusive political systems. The VDEM Research Institute cites several democracy researchers who have shown that in the last 25 years, following democratization, democratic countries increase their GDP per capita by 20% more than autocracies. Likewise, there's a clear economic incentive to focus on prevention. A 2018 study carried out by the World Bank and the United Nations found that for every $1 that is spent on prevention, it costs $16 in response and mitigation in real time once violence has started over the past 20 years. And so not only is there a moral imperative to sort of act early and to do the prevention side instead of getting into the response and mitigation and triage, it's just actually good business sense as well. Throughout the world, this is understood, and despite rising authoritarianism in recent years, democracy is still the most popular and desired form of government globally. People in every region aspire to govern themselves and exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms without fear of reprisal. This is why democratic principles, the advancement of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the fight against corruption are at the center of our foreign policy. Our democratic values are a wellspring of our strength, and they're an advantage of the United States, and also our allies on the global stage. Democratic societies that value their populations are simply less likely to succumb to atrocity, crime, and violence. Against the backdrop of increasing authoritarian threats, the Biden-Harris administration has placed democratic renewal, promotion, and the advancement of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the fight against corruption at the center of US foreign policy. As President Biden stated, democracy does not happen by accident. We have to defend it, we have to fight for it, strengthen it, renew it. Collectively, we must demonstrate democracy's unique ability to deliver effective responses to the critical challenges of our time. And as someone who sits in the Democracy Bureau, that's squarely our remit and our responsibility to advocate abroad. Moving from kind of big, broad democracy, I'd like to shift now to a more kind of focused discussion on how we address the atrocity risk that we find globally. As stated in the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act, in our national security strategy and in the United States strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocities, we clearly affirm that atrocity and genocide prevention are in our national interest. Exactly how to operationalize those goals is a challenge, but one that I take comfort in because of our willingness to try, because of our clear articulation of our values and the value in doing this work. Because we believe that there is a necessity in doing this sort of work and are willing to put resources, United States tax money and individuals, in the sole aim of trying to address atrocity risk globally. Atrocities endanger international peace, stability, and prosperity, and threaten the rules-based international order, and as such, we have committed to addressing atrocity risk. One of the requirements of the Elie-Wiesel Act is to do an annual report on what actions have taken part from the USG, from the administration to Congress. The most recent report is the 2023. And in the 2023 Elie-Wiesel report, it addresses the atrocities that we're seeing globally, along with our collective work to address atrocities and atrocity risk. On February 18th of 2023, Secretary Blinken announced his determination that members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials had committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. These crimes include murder, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and conflict-related sexual violence, and also deportation of population, including children. The United States continues to impose sanctions, visa restrictions, and other actions on individuals and entities connected to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including designating the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization on January 26, 2023. The United States continues to work with allies and partners to call on the People's Republic of China to end its crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang. The United States remains engaged in ongoing efforts to prevent refoulement to the People's Republic of China of Uyghurs and other members of the ethnic and religious minority groups who fled persecution and prosecution or torture in Xinjiang. In June 2022, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force published a strategy to prevent the importation of goods mined, produced, or manufactured with forced labor in the People's Republic of China. Since then, the Department of Homeland Security's Customs and Border Protection has stopped 3,237 shipments valued at $961 million in fiscal years 2022 and 2023 to date. They denied 424 shipments worth 23.8 because they were made by Uyghur forced labor. This basically is a tangible and concrete means of enacting cost for using forced labor and for the persecution of Uyghur and other ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang province. We continue to work often behind the scenes on countries that don't generate as much public awareness, like Sudan, South Sudan, Burma, and Afghanistan. As we've seen again and again, the failure to hold wrongdoers accountable makes future crises more likely. If we think about the cycles of violence, if you don't do the downstream, the recovery, the restitution piece, you can pretty much set your watch and wait for the next iteration where you're back into the cycle of violence. The horrific situation that we see in Darfur today is reminiscent of the widespread killings of 2003. Innocent people are suffering, and the United States is working every day towards ending that conflict. How we address the risk, we find, is laid out in our strategy, which was the point of drafting it, so that there is a clear articulation of how we approach these threats. The means by which we are better aligning and coordinating our efforts is a whole of government approach. And I really mean whole of government. It's not just simply a State Department or United States Agency on International Development Strategy, but an actual interagency product that has the support and buy-in from the various departments and agencies, but also a means to disrupt and process that leads to atrocities as well in other countries and our efforts to protect those populations from the threat. And to respond to those crimes in a survivor-centered and trauma-informed way once they do actually occur. As the ambassador mentioned, as a retired naval officer, I've sort of gotten to see both the Department of Defense and Department of State side, and realizing that we are so much better served when we are working collectively and maximizing our strengths, and that the strategy and the law itself are an attempt to kind of break down those silos and make sure that we are sort of approaching it with all of the tools. These are huge, knotty, difficult problems. And so in order to address them in a means that's actually capable, you have to bring everything to bear, which includes the full United States government, as well as our international partners. It also means interacting, obviously, with civil society and academia, which is why I'm here chatting with you all today. The Atrocity Prevention Task Force, which is the sort of interagency government entity charged with being the coordinator for this kind of work, continues to, and it expands upon the work that was begun under the Atrocity Prevention Board, which you may be aware of, or the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, which are different names for the same body that precede us. This body is composed of members of departments and agencies from across the United States government, each with their own set of diplomatic, assistance, economic, defense, and other tools that can be leveraged towards addressing and preventing atrocities and mitigating human suffering. In the State Department, I have dear colleagues in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations who are doing amazing work in improving early warning, improving our analytical capabilities so that we can act early. You can't do early action in the prevention space if you don't know where to do the action. And so being smarter and more clear in how to do so was one of the charges that came out of the Elie Wiesel Act and something that we focused on in the strategy. How do we make sure that we're using our analytic capability and our ability to gain information globally, especially in those locally informed contexts, to make sure that we're looking at the right things and moving out in a smart fashion? And colleagues in CSO are sort of doing that work day in and day out. The Office of Global Criminal Justice is our lead office on accountability, on transitional justice, on supporting work globally to stop impunity. How do you make sure that perpetrators don't keep doing perpetration? You show that they're not going to get away with it. You end impunity. You do the work to make sure that they realize there is a cost for using atrocities as a tool. And it also has a, hopefully, deterrent effect for others that might look at. I have a great anecdote from a colleague in the UK, where was doing some work in sub-Saharan Africa and came across an armed group. And someone asked the question, what is the Hague? And the fact that in that armed group, they were aware that the Hague existed and that there is a mechanism to hold individuals accountable means that the word is getting out and that there's awareness that these sorts of crimes and tools are not unlimited. And so I think obviously holding folks accountable has a huge part to play in ending those cycles of violence. The Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues is a critical partner in ensuring that we are approaching atrocity prevention with a gendered lens and addressing the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. We recognize that conflict-related sexual violence, gender-based violence are atrocities in and of themselves, but are also clear indicators of future violence and sort of broader atrocity trends. And so partnering, thinking through, ensuring that when we are talking about atrocity prevention, we're doing so with a gendered lens and not in a stovepipe fashion, not in an ancillary fashion, but as part of mainstream efforts. And that we are, from the very beginning, as we're thinking about atrocity risk, we are including those dynamics as part of it. These are just a few examples, but there are so many colleagues across the department, desk officers, regional colleagues, functional folks that are doing atrocity prevention on a daily basis. Maybe it's called development, maybe it's called democracy promotion, but all of that ultimately ends up as atrocity prevention because as you affect any of those individual indicators, you are driving atrocity risk down. Thinking through partnership and realizing that obviously we as the United States cannot do this alone. It's not a USG only event. Engagement with our partners and our allies bilaterally through multilateral fora is really important and critical towards addressing atrocity risk, as the root causes of these problems are some of the knottiest that we face. Our efforts alone are insufficient to turn the tide, and so we clearly recognize the need to galvanize like-minded partners and the international community more broadly. And I'm always incredibly heartened and enthused by how many folks do want to do this work and are interested in, and those that I'm able to reach out through the constellation of those that are in this community of practice, that oftentimes when facing obviously the darkness of what we work on, realizing that you're standing shoulder to shoulder with incredibly thoughtful and caring and deeply engaged individuals globally certainly makes it feel like, okay, we can keep pushing because you're not pushing alone. I quote from the strategy, the task force will strive for consultative, coordinated, and transparent activities to prevent, respond to, and foster recovery from atrocities, including both with strategic and public messaging. The U.S. government will invite collaboration with a large range of stakeholders, including UN agencies, regional organizations, partner governments, local populations, and civil society and related consortia, including the academic community. We do not have the patent on the best ideas. And so currently and working to always engage and make sure that we're hearing from those individuals that are affected by these risk dynamics and those that have the thought and information on how best to respond, which is, again, very much why coming here and having the conversation with you all is important to make sure that we are doing so in the most informed mechanism that we can. It does mean regular engagement with the full constellation community of practice and with prevention professionals, including in the academic and practitioner spaces. It's not just a good idea. It's clearly stated as a job requirement and one of necessary action. I would say, if we look at the Elie Wiesel Act, there are two kind of legal requirements, one of which is to do reporting, which I talked about, and the other is training. The Elie Wiesel Act obligates actors from across the U.S. government, be it in an office in Washington or in one of the 300 diplomatic missions worldwide, to be trained on how to identify and work towards addressing and reducing atrocity risk. You can only do early action if individuals that are seeing early warning understand what to do about it. Early warning's great, but it's only so interesting in the so what and the what next, which is actually where you go and do the work of prevention. Simply knowing that something bad is coming and then sitting back and watching it doesn't seem terribly interesting from my perspective. We have dedicated and continue to dedicate considerable resources to training on atrocity prevention. Our Foreign Service officers are trained to raise the alarm when they see troubling warning signs. All of our staff have to be empowered to do so and to do that reporting, to make sure that the context that they have on the ground and the conversations that they're having with either locally employed staff or those that they interact with have the ability to get that information to policymakers and policy decision makers. And so it's our responsibility in Washington to hear them and to act on that information in sufficient timely fashion that we can actually save lives and it's not too late. Acting early is always our best chance at preventing human suffering and stemming further instability. But we can, again, only act early if we have an organization that is biased towards action and is able to recognize those early warning signs in sufficient time and clarity to act before the condition worsens to a level beyond our capacity to understand and to respond. Obviously, there is the financial case to be made for prevention, but there's also the case to be made for how many more tools are available in the prevention space. If you want to do intercommunal peace building, if you want to do youth peace building, if you want to point out the similarities that two different populations have more so than the differences, that becomes significantly more difficult once the bullets start flying. When you are still in that point where there's risk, but you haven't gotten to the outbreak of violence, there's just so many more options and oftentimes in significantly less cost, significantly less risk. And so why we have biased our strategy and others into that prevention space is specifically because we have the most tools available at that point. We have to hold ourselves accountable to the standard of sort of working towards prevention. Last week, I was in Bogota, Colombia, and I led a training for members from across the department where we were able to share best practices, to discuss what special skills and resources and opportunities each of us brought to the table, and to really think about how to leverage our collective skills and areas of expertise to make us as efficient and effective as we can be. We went and visited a site of conscience to confront what the long lingering effects of atrocities are on communities and survivors, and to make real to the participants of the training what the cost is of not responding. We discussed the trauma that survivors face and how we can support those personnel, including psychosocial resources and transitional justice mechanisms, as well as what we must do to support one another in this work, as there is a toll for those that continue to confront the most evil that humans do to one another. Obviously, there is always the trauma of those survivors, but there's the secondary trauma and inherited trauma of those that do this work as well. And recognizing that and bolstering that is how we don't burn out our population and ensure that we have the ability for those that continue to do this work. That means a holistic approach to justice, both restorative and retributive, criminal accountability, and psychosocial support for survivors. And that thinking through that kind of full spectrum and understanding of justice is the bedrock of our approach. Justice must be full spectrum and must meet the needs of those affected versus being prescribed from Washington. And I was thankful for the fulsome conversation we were able to have for those that are in need. Training is great and that's important, but it's not just a U.S. effort alone. We've consistently sought those opportunities to train with our allies and partners. And we have shared our curriculum abroad and our best practices with those like-minded partners because we recognize that if we're going to operate together, why wouldn't we likewise train together? And that the more all of us are biased towards action and have the ability to share information, we are all better served to do so. That also means that we've invited civil society when possible to join us, because obviously their perspective, as called out in the strategy and in the Elie Wiesel Act, is crucial to our understanding. So it is not simply the government monolith operating without listening to those that have the advocacy piece at their helm. We continue to look for more opportunities to expand our global community of practice, and we'll continue to do so. I have at one point or another been called entrepreneurial, in sort of the expansion of that and been told that that's a good thing. And so as long as I can continue to get kind of push and expand and move, I will continue to do so, resources pending. Thinking through kind of the training piece, let's turn, I think, now to a bit more from the macro and discuss collectively where we're coming together to actually do some of the tangible prevention and addressing atrocity risk. I believe that it takes all of us working collectively together and that we all have to be doing our part. And I'd like to tell you a bit kind of in the overall constellation where we in the Democracy Human Rights Bureau are doing this work. We are one of those kind of primary government entities that funds and supports atrocity prevention programming via a congressional earmark to do this work that we get annually. Again, because we have an earmark means that Congress and the Hill and the administration have determined that this is something we're going to do, which then gives us the ability to move out and do that. This programming seeks to bolster the self-protection and resilience capacities of vulnerable groups, to mitigate atrocity risk factors and deter potential perpetrators. Community-based early warning response systems are one method that, when properly designed and implemented, meet these atrocity prevention objectives. I had the good fortune of talking to one of our implementers towards the end of last week, and continues to provide absolutely unbelievable anecdotes of really simple systems, high-frequency radios, enabling individual communities to call one another, to scatter when atrocity perpetrators are coming so that they can protect themselves. He has an amazing picture of a father and son being reunited via the early warning network, where a child who had been abducted into an armed group is pulled out and is then able to get home using these kind of networks and these volunteer communities. And so when you're looking for kind of the tangible, the concrete, the real, like what actually are you doing for those communities? Clear, demonstrated improvement in their situation as a result of the work that we're doing. Ultimately, we're trying to break down those cycles of impunity and utilize innovative technologies and approaches to atrocity prevention. Atrocity prevention is not so old. This, as a field of study, is still relatively nascent. And so we are constantly looking to learn and improve our practices. And honestly, in talking to the academic and civil society community, so much of that amazing research is happening there. And so that our responses are better informed and ultimately tailored as a result of those conversations. DRL does fund atrocity prevention programs around the globe. In this programming space, we're often working with limited funding and resources in difficult and insecure operating environments, but that's where the need is and that's where the risk is, and so that's where we have to go. It is critical in these circumstances to find a way to maximize our impact and ensure that what we support is not only effective, but also sustainably and locally owned, and to do this work in a way that does not cause any additional harm. I think all of us are familiar with the do no harm principle, and this is something that we take incredibly seriously. We only want to be doing that work that is furthering these aims and not exacerbating the underlying risk dynamics. DRL has long invested in programming for atrocity prevention goals. We've seen successes, in particular with our strategic approach to meet communities where they are, build on their existing resiliencies, and provide modest support that supports and bolsters their ability to protect themselves, locally led, locally informed, with us supporting instead of dictating. And that paradigm shift is crucial if you're actually going to have the effects that you're aiming for. We were incredibly grateful to work with partners who have the unique combined skill sets of peace building, security, human rights, atrocity prevention, transitional justice. And because of that, we're able to do really tailored, really curated, specific grassroots owned and grassroots led approaches to atrocity prevention in a whole bunch of different regions. Our implementers approach obviously aligns with DRL's belief that effective atrocity prevention must be rooted in empowerment of those that are actually impacted and those that are facing the atrocity risk. And it has to incorporate both a horizontal and a vertical component, meaning that they're talking amongst one another as well as talking up, and that they are sustaining one another and using best practices and passing that information. A bit more detail on one form of atrocity prevention program in particular with the early warning systems. It's basically what's so important and so crucial and so beneficial is that they address not only the practicality of early warning, but the underlying drivers of risk through efforts in social cohesion and mediation and community-led. Images of folks, with a stick on the ground, sort of laying out, this is where we're going to go, this is how we're going to move, this is the strategy that we're going to be able to do, ensuring for them and for their population a response that gives them a sense of ownership and leading in their own protection. Additionally, we've seen that early warning systems are really cost effective, really grassroots way to communicate for communities to remain safe and secure, especially in rural areas, well out there beyond the reach of other responders, especially as it relates to state-led protection resources. We are incredibly grateful for our partners' efforts in this space. And you may notice that I'm being not necessarily super specific on who some of those partners are. That's also to keep them safe and realizing that they are placing themselves at incredible risk. And so we have the ability to fund without attribution, which remains incredibly important to make sure that we are giving resources to those that have the ability to make the most change, but not further increasing what is already a high amount of risk for them in doing this level of work. Zooming out a bit more broadly, as we continue to see progress in some of the development indicators kind of globally, we also see continued massive human suffering and destabilizing efforts across different settings. Many of it is man-made and is preventable, and if we were to do so and take the action necessary. There are a number of converging global pressures and trends that clearly remind us on the need to elevate the importance of atrocity prevention. I would say, obviously, the global pandemic, the food crisis that followed, all of these things have certainly exacerbated and increased what was already a high level of risk. Our agenda includes demanding democracy and advancing human rights, applying the voices of women leaders in all their roles, tackling the climate crisis when and where we can, and rebuilding our alliances and multilateral institutions for shared action with the recognition that we can't do this alone. These all are in recognition broadly that this is essential and central to America's enduring security and prosperity. So what does this mean for our ability to treat atrocity risk and acting to prevent while also addressing these very same challenges? It means that we're trying really to weave together the links between democracy and state fragility and atrocity prevention and addressing authoritarianism across these lines. And that democratic values and institutions offer the best inoculation and best prescription against atrocities and atrocity risk. In my home office of the Office of Security and Human Rights, I work daily with the Senior Advisor on Civilian Harm Mitigation, who's working globally to investigate, address, and then minimize future incidents of civilian harm. I'm fortunate to stand with other senior advisors on human rights and United States assistance and arms transfers, who are working to ensure that U.S. funds and weapons don't go to those that would abuse human rights or commit atrocities in accordance with the conventional arms transfer policy. The Senior Advisor on Visa Restrictions and Sanctions and her team stand ready to use those tools and authorities we have to ensure that those human rights abusers don't have freedom of movement and don't have the ability to come to the United States, and often their families as well. I have the great pleasure of working with colleagues as the Senior Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict and the Senior Advisor on Women, Peace, and Security, who spend countless hours fighting for marginalized populations and those that are at increased risk during atrocity situations, because marginalized populations face increased risk and intersectional risk when atrocity dynamics come to be. I am amazed and bolstered by all of my colleagues and their tireless work and their clear dedication to protecting civilians globally. Finally, we must continue to seek justice when prevention fails and mass atrocities take place. We must end impunity for the worst violations of human rights and atrocities, and also continue to promote peace and stability, as it is a key tool in prevention itself. This work, sadly, does not end, but I am so thankful that you and the rest of the community believe that this work is worth doing. And for those of you that have thought about coming to the State Department or working on this work, I highly encourage you to do so, because we can always find more folks that want to push in the right direction. At this point, I thank you all so much for your attention, and I think we will move now to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Jeff. That was an excellent overview, and we will be taking questions from the audience here with us today and from online. So those of you online, please submit your questions and we will pose them to Jeff in the question and answer period. let me just say first, that was a terrific overview with a lot of details and great anecdotes and what you and your team and the State Department and embassies are doing overseas. And this is dangerous work. It's not easy. And we have seen Foreign Service officers and civil service others killed promoting human rights in our values as Americans overseas. So thank you for what you're doing and to all of your team. And so now let's open it up. I think I saw a hand up. Yes, ma'am. Let me bring you the microphone.
I can sit down, right?
Yeah.
Please.
So the Atrocities Prevention Board is described as an interagency coalition. How does that change how it's affected by possible budget cuts or changes as election cycles and administration goes? How does I guess it would be good to hear how any government or agency, let alone one composed of many agencies, is affected by changes to its budget, and how you prepare and respond to what might happen if funding looks drastically different.
I have, I think, the great luxury of being one of the least political positions there is. There is no one in the United States government who is pro-genocide or is pro-crimes against humanity. Having gone and spoken to colleagues in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or others, the bipartisan, the Elie Wiesel Act was passed bipartisan. The report is bipartisan, specifically because both sides believe that this is worth doing. And I've done this work under multiple administrations with administrative change, and have only seen the ability to do the work go up, not down, and have actually seen kind of consistency, be it funding levels, be it level of interest, et cetera. And so where I think certain things obviously get difficult for some other folks, the specific sandbox that I work in and the specific area where I work remains bipartisan. And so that changes in administration don't seem, and again, this is my perspective from the seat that I sit in, but I have had no lessened ability to continue the work that I do. And as a result of that, that's really heartening. And that's really, I think, something to sort of be optimistic about, that we believe as a government that this is in our nation's interest, not in a party or anything like that, but in our nation's interest to do this work. And so I hope, optimistic that continues, and that we continue to believe that this is worth doing and worth investing in and worth doing and focusing on. Obviously, as funding levels change, you have to make adjustments here and there. And I think sometimes there is differences of opinion of what should be prioritized and where we should focus, because obviously the prevention side upstream, you're sort of looking at those countries in that orange and yellow range instead of in the full kind of red range. I think sometimes the response phase gets a bit more dictated by what is the focus of the moment, what's on the front page of the Post or the Times. But from a prevention space, pretty much able to consistently kind of do this work and have gotten support from our legislators and those that do the appropriations to continue to do so.
It's a student wants to go first.
All right. So I'm sure you're well aware of the ethnic cleansing campaign by Azerbaijan and Turkey that just eliminated the more than 2,000-year-old presence of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. This was perpetrated by two regimes that are notorious for repression of rights within their own borders and aggression outside. There are horrific videos easily available of the atrocities that were committed by the perpetrators. The United States has given almost $200 million in military aid to Azerbaijan over the last 20 years, and much more to Turkey. We have supported them diplomatically in all sorts of ways. And as this whole horrific situation unfolded, especially over the last year, the U.S. did nothing concrete to stop it. We didn't withdraw weapons. We didn't do anything. My questions are multiple. What is the U.S. now going to do to try to prevent further aggression stated by both Aliyev and Erdogan, leaders of the two countries, their stated goal of eliminating Armenians from the Caucasus, which is a statement of genocidal intent that's fairly rare. What do you see the State Department doing to return the 140,000 Armenians who were brutally removed from their ancestral homeland over the past 6 months, to give them a return to their homeland and safety and security? And in line with, a number of the very fine principles you've spoken about, specifically the accountability of perpetrators who have used U.S. weapons and so forth to do this. What accountability is the U.S. now pursuing to ensure that the perpetrators of this, particularly Elie of more than anyone else, and those in his government and in his military who directly or indirectly committed atrocities, are going to be held accountable?
So I would say, first off, the assertion that the United States government did nothing, I would take issue with. Because we have obviously a global remit, we are looking at so many different circumstances at all times and acting accordingly. Your questions regarding weapons, the Convention on Transfer Policy clearly states that we will not continue to put U.S. weapons abroad that further increase the likelihood of atrocity risk. And my colleague who works on that continues to be the voice of human rights in those kind of decision makings and will continue to do so. I know definitively and personally in speaking to individuals in both Armenia and Azerbaijan at our embassies, the work that is ongoing as far as addressing those that have been displaced and the mechanisms, options for justice eventually. And that all continues and will continue to go forward. I think we, as the United States, because of our relationship with both sides, have a part to play in constructively moving forward and to seeking accountability. Thankfully, some of these things happen behind the scenes in the means to try to be effective and helpful. And so I don't have the ability to go into further detail. But I will tell you that, during training, I have talked and been fortunate enough to serve with individuals and work with individuals at both of those locations. And that kind of what I've talked about from the underpinnings and mechanisms of atrocity prevention that they've taken back with them. And that options as far as documentation or options as far as eventual accountability and all of that are things that we undertake as normal practice and as sort of our day-to-day. And so I don't know if that's going to be satisfying for you, but it's certainly not a context that I am unfamiliar with, and certainly not one that I'm confident in saying that work continues.
Not satisfying, but I appreciate your role and your position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's the point of having a Q&A if you can't ask the good ones? So.
Next. Hi, I'm an international student from Belize, and my country is considered a developing country. And what I really wanted to ask is, you said that you've done like trainings in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And so that like kind of interested me, but I just wanted to know like how your department views the role of international community and developing countries, specifically countries that were colonized by Britain. And like my country is it's like situated right in between Mexico and Guatemala. And so I just would want to know like your perspective on like a developing country that's like a hub for human trafficking and drug trafficking, and how like your organization could have an influence on like possibly like conducting trainings in like a country like Belize, and like what role like you'd probably have in like influencing atrocity prevention in a developing country that was once colonized by Britain and received like our independence in like 1981.
So I think, at least from where I sit and where my bureau sits, our belief is 100% that it must be with the people of Belize or the people of Colombia or the people of wherever it is we're talking, right? That I don't in any way feel comfortable dictating or determining or driving or deciding. Ultimately, you will decide and your fellow individuals will decide what is ultimately in your best interest. Like that's the belief in democracy, right? You have to be able to make that decision and to see where that goes and that your population will do so. I am really of the belief that we can be of assistance, right? We can help with explaining how civil society is not a threat, but is actually a crucial and vital portion in a functioning government. We send out the Elie Wiesel report every year. And the Protection and Prevention Working Group immediately writes up a really large report on everything we've done wrong and everything that we haven't accomplished. And that's not a threat. That is them holding their government accountable, which is part of the process. And I read that completely interested in hearing what they have to say. And so thinking through how do we empower, how do we lift up the voices of those, a functioning fourth estate with journalism is crucial and important. And how do we incentivize and explain that, yes, occasionally there will be things written that you don't love, but the net good, the net improvement of a free speech, of a free journalism is so important to the system working the way that it's supposed to. Thinking through how do we help build rule of law? How do we, I have colleagues that work in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement that do work specifically on training judges and other judiciary on how to actually hold themselves and their governments and perpetrators accountable, recognizing that if people have belief in the rule of law and in the validity of the government, the likelihood that it's more sustainable, that it's going to last is better. And so I think from a DRL perspective, that's where we can be of benefit is in being a source of information, a source of a resource, the ability to kind of bolster and push that conversation, and are always interested in doing so and working through our embassies and working through the human rights officers at post. That's I think specifically what we would do, and it's so not so much a matter of you should do X, but hey, we've done this and we've seen this is helpful. If you'd like to know more, we'd love to talk to you about it. I think one of the questions that we often get is, who are you to dictate this to us? Because it's not like you all are perfect. And the answer is 100%. I do not advocate from this from a place of, we've got this thing completely licked and you should do what we say. No, we're trying to figure it out in the same time. And that it comes from a place of humility, not from a place of authority, that we all have to do work on this. Democracy and human rights have to be fought for day in and day out, even in places where, there is the axiom, there's atrocity risk in every country context. And sometimes people, I think, sort of hand wave that as being trite, but no, there's atrocity risk in every country context. There is always the ability for division and that to happen. And so from a United States perspective, from our ability to, I think, be helpful, to, I think, sort of do this work, to recognize that we're going to put resources and assistance and sort of go out there, it's from a place of we'd like to help other people get better also, while recognizing we have to do that ourselves.
I saw there's a question by Alex, Richard, a few online, but we have time here. But we have time. You're very much encouraged to continue the conversation. So.
It's on.
It's pretty percentage.
Oh, sorry.
Is that better? Okay. All right. So here we go.
Yeah, thanks so much for your work. And that was a really helpful overview, sort of laying everything out. First I had a question that I guess I'm not going to ask about how things like AI, new media technologies, you mentioned climate change in the space we're impacting, but instead I think I want to ask another question, maybe that would help students as well. So you have this great overview of the different pieces. Could you sort of give a quick explanation of one case where they came together and worked?
Yeah.
One case where they came together and they didn't work?
Coming together is, I think, not so hard, right? Like we've kind of now at this point had 11 years of sort of the mechanics and knowing who is my point of contact at Department of Treasury, who's my point of contact at the FBI, et cetera. That's actually pretty well laid out. And so I think we have a pretty good understanding of kind of how that works. Uganda recently passed one of the truly most atrocious pieces of legislation criminalizing LGBTQI individuals, and the quickness and speed and consistency in which our condemnation, our pushback, our trying to use the different levels that we have was a result of having done a bunch of work on the front end and ensuring that we sort of knew what was coming, and then our ability to sort of push back about it, because it clearly is going to put people at risk and will increase their likelihood of undoing that. As far as issues where it has not gone as well as we wanted, I would say that, you know, the exit from Afghanistan was not in the way that any of us that had sort of done that work would have hoped for, and that there has been a ton of work internally to try to do the lessons learned and what could we do better the next time? How could we take those and sort of carry that forward? I think that will continue. I mean, the whole reason why the Atrocity Prevention Board exists was coming out of Rwanda, and the fact that the United States response was not as timely or as effective as anybody felt comfortable with. And there was a recognition that we had to find a means to sort of do that. I'd say the fact that we're back into violence in Sudan is certainly a concern, because it's so many of the same players. And so the work continues and it's not done. And just because you get to a place of a cessation of hostilities or you have a moment of pause, that does not mean take the foot off the gas. If anything, continue to push and continue to work all the way through the cycle, and ensure that those that were ultimately responsible are held accountable. I have no worry that my job will not have enough work to do for the foreseeable future. I'd love to be out of work. I mean, like, it would be fantastic if we reached a point where, yeah, I'm going to go get a beverage because there's no more risk anywhere. But sadly, that's not the case. And so we have to kind of, you know, eternal vigilance in responding to that.
So thank you for your talk and for that good work that you do. You had mentioned a number of examples of situations around the world that your office is involved in, and you'd mentioned the issue of arms transfers. But it was noticeable you didn't mention the situation in Gaza, given its scale and the prominence that you know, the attention that that's received. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether your office is involved in that part of the world, and what opportunities you see there for bringing it into the suffering in that area.
We have stated as a government clearly that Israel has a right to defend itself, and that has been consistent messaging throughout. Immediately following that is Israel has a responsibility to follow international humanitarian law, the law of war, et cetera, and when using any, but especially US origin weapons, they have a responsibility to minimize civilian harm as much as possible. And we continue to, through channels, through the highest levels of leadership, through any and all processes we have, to clearly articulate that and continue to do so. And there are processes and means in which we review and we look at and we make decisions, and that, you know, my office, as the office that has security and human rights and has the senior advisor on human rights and arms transfers, she and her team are constantly working to advocate for, to think through any and all decisions that we make globally as far as US origin defense articles. And so a belief that we should not be furthering civilian harm and civilian violence through our weapons is why her position exists, why that team exists, why the conventional arms transfer policy exists. And so those processes continue to ongo and continue to be discussed. You know, I think we are all better served when weapons are not used in means that further civilian suffering, are used in means that go after civilian infrastructure and things like that. And so that those rules are the same for Israel as they are for any other country kind of globally, and that we've stated them and continue to state them in each of the contexts in which we do exports. Obviously, I'm hopeful that we all get to a place where fewer civilians are harmed. Like that's just not just a good idea, but morally correct. It's also tactically and strategically correct as well.
Thank you. We have a fair number of questions online. I think you've just answered actually a number of them, but there's a couple here that I think relate to each other, so I'll put them together for you. And so the first one is the explanation of global efforts was helpful, but the US seems to be at a pivotal time for democracy. What do you see as the greatest risks domestically? And then related to that is another one that asks, given your experiences with this topic applied to other countries, what do you think we should be doing here at home? What strategies would you advise another country or group that might apply here?
I work for the State Department. I am required to think abroad. And so I don't work domestically. That is not. I have unbelievable colleagues that do that are part of the task force. You can't sort of do this work and look at risk factors and know what the risk factors are and then not read the paper and see them showing up. And so when I say that there is atrocity risk in every country, I include the United States as part of that and understand that. It's not my job to sort of do that work. I worry as a civilian, I worry as a voter, I worry as a person, because I don't want to see the things that we see abroad happen here. Basic decency to one another, recognizing our things that we share more than the things that drive us apart, believing that despite our failures, despite our challenges, there is still a good and a importance in what we could be, thinking through our better instincts and what that might look like. All of those things to me, fostering youth, addressing marginalized populations, all of the prescriptions that sort of work, I believe would work. And so it's not specifically my area, it's not specifically the focus of my work, but as Jeff, I'd love to see us continue to sort of improve. And some of that's also addressing our history, right? Like we know definitively that if you don't address issues, they will eventually come back around and in cycles of violence. And I don't think we collectively as a nation have always reckoned with our own history of atrocities. And so that's an important part to play. No one benefits from simply wiping things under the carpet and pretending they don't exist. That will continue to fester and will continue to provide challenge and difficulty.
Thanks for your presentation and for the work that you do. So you mentioned the ability to fund without attribution and the funding and the like. And I wonder how public accountability falls into this. Sort of the public wants to know how their money is being spent. How does this fit into the picture? I have in mind in particular US support for Ukraine obviously has been a huge issue in public discourse. And substantial amounts of money have already been sent. Sure, we're dealing with an all-out war, atrocities have been committed, but we're still at a point where we can speak about future atrocity prevention and the like, and let alone sort of the collapse of the Ukrainian state, flawed but democratic, and pending a Ukrainian victory, there will no doubt be more work to be done to consolidate that democracy. So I guess I want to sort of frame this idea of public accountability within the title of the talk, sort of promoting democracy, confronting authoritarianism, right? So you have to hold funding recipients accountable, right? Because people want to know where the money is being spent. Yet at the same time, public disclosure in real time of how this money is being spent potentially jeopardizes the ability to use that money effectively. And I guess potentially, but I think again, within the framework of the talk, sort of confronting authoritarianism, authoritarians don't have to publicly disclose how they're using their money, where they're spending, where they're buying weapons. Sure, we see on the ground that Iranian drones are being used. I guess, so the question is just how does public accountability fit into this, in particular in Ukraine? And I guess this also plays into future prevention, impunity, and like.
So I view the accountability as a feature, not a bug, right? Like if we believe that democracy is the mechanism that is best suited to doing this, and that is best suited to inoculating countries and populations from the worst of violence, then public accountability is part and parcel of that. Why do we have an atrocity reporting requirement annually as part of the Elie Wiesel Act? Because those that have made the decision to appropriate funds want to know how we've spent their money. And so there is now 5 years of reporting on how we've done it and what we've done it. Now, there are always the ability to provide other classified annexes for kind of more sensitive or classified information as far as that. But you can Google the last few years of the Elie Wiesel report and see what we've done, because there's a belief that we're better served by doing that, and that we should be held accountable by those that we represent. And I should be able to answer a question on like generally what we're doing. You can give a fair bit of understanding of kind of what's happening without necessarily naming an individual implementer or an individual kind of organization. You can give the sense of kind of what the work looks like. And I think we clearly articulate to our friends and partners, and sometimes individuals that are more in that kind of gray area, that again, this is to your good, that like those authoritarians that want to kind of keep all of that information close, that eventually that will come to roost, and that leads to corruption, and that leads to elites getting all of the resources and not those that most need them, and leads to cronyism and all of those sorts of things. And so our requirement to be able to report is actually part of transparency and part of democratic processes. And so I think we should be required to be able to explain what we're doing with the money. It shouldn't just be at the whim of an individual. And, you know, I have unbelievable colleagues that work in our Office of Global Programs, and we work hand in hand, where I provide a policy input and then they find the means to actually go and do that. And we look at the history of who we're doing implementation, and we have measurement and evaluation and learning specifically to make sure that the money that we're spending, are we getting the effects that we wanted? Are we doing that kind of feedback loop to make sure that once we spend United States taxpayer dollars, is it moving the needle? Is it driving the change? And do we have mechanisms in place that we can think about that kind of going the next time? And can we learn from it? Or can we make changes midstream where we can do updates and realize, hey, this part is working, this part isn't, so let's focus more here and less here. All of those are in place specifically to make sure that we're A, doing the work the way that we want to, and B, we can articulate that and have the ability to sort of explain. I mean, one of my favorite things is talking to implementers, where I get kind of those anecdotes of what they've done, because, there's no better way to sort of explain, like, hey, these kids are now home. Like, this family is alive and they would not have been otherwise. This IDP camp saw a 72% reduction in gender-based violence because we put some flashlights and some raincoats, and then they could do watches at night. And so it drove down like tangible, concrete, hard improvements for those communities in ways that we can then articulate, so that when folks ask the question of why are you doing this and what are you doing, we have the ability to answer that in a fulsome fashion that kind of not just answers curiosity, but answers the good idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so I think, you know, there will continue to be, as there should be, questions as far as how resources are allocated, what's the right number, how to do it, and things like that. And that will happen. But from a person who's actually kind of doing the work, I think it's my duty to make sure that I have the ability to answer that question in a fulsome manner.
Thank you for speaking with us today. My question was, what is the US's role, or how does the US navigate when there is local resistance to US intervention in atrocity prevention?
Sometimes we're not the right face, and that's okay. Sometimes we shouldn't be in the lead. Sometimes it should be a partner or another organization, and we should be kind of more in the back and just simply being supportive, and having the humility to realize it doesn't need to be the US show all the time is really, really important. And you can only sort of figure that out if you actually understand what the local context is and what the expectations are. And that takes humility and time and research and empathy and all of those sorts of things. But there are plenty of examples where we shouldn't be front and center. It should not be US led. It should be US supported. It should be quiet. But, the amount of things that happen, I mean, that's what diplomacy is, right? It's like meeting and figuring out how to get forward and have the right conversation and build rapport. As a military officer, you do 12 months and then new job, 18 months, new job, 24 months and new job. And that's kind of the mechanism. And for foreign service officers, it's pretty similar. I've been doing this job for 7 years, which is the longest I have ever done a job as an adult. And it is amazing what happens over that time, right? You develop networks and you learn and you meet people and they know who to call. And something that was kind of a innocuous conversation in a coffee break at a meeting in the Netherlands, 3 years later is a program where you're actually kind of doing something and moving it forward. And so some of the work is to build those networks and build that credibility and be viewed as a good and thoughtful and reliable partner so that when things are going bad in a place where maybe we shouldn't be, they can at least call and be like, hey, probably shouldn't be you, but who else should we be talking to? Who could be the lead on this? Who could be kind of the driver if our involvement or our history or our name is ultimately unhelpful? Simply doing it just cause is both a waste of time and energy and resources, and pretty sure to mean we're going to be unsuccessful. And so I am quite content to not be the name face. I'm also content oftentimes to not have the dirty A word include. Like folks sometimes get really upset about the atrocity word or the implication that there is atrocity risk. And if that's going to be unhelpful or going to make things more challenging, no, it's not. We're just doing rule of law. We're just doing democracy promotion. We're just doing whatever the case may be. I ultimately want to get to the aim of reducing the risk. If the nomenclature is going to be an impediment to that, then let's change the nomenclature. Let's figure out something else. Let's figure out who should be at the lead. And I think being agile and thoughtful about that is incredibly important. And being okay with sometimes somebody else is going to get credit. Cool. If a whole bunch of folks didn't die, great.
For your talk and for answering all these questions, I wanted to ask about, so atrocity obviously leads to things that are very emotionally upsetting. And I want to ask how you balance the kind of more moderate prevention or response things of we're asking countries to not, attack civilians and destroy heritage sites with the more radical response of we see a genocide or atrocity happening and we're actively we're cutting off, economic relations, we're not giving any more support, or even going as far to we're coming over to stop this. How do you balance that kind of the radical and emotional independence now response with the kind of more sometimes what you have to do with more moderate bureaucratic stuff? I think that's really complicated, and I'm curious about how you balance that personally, and also just the department, how you find it.
So I was at the point where I was eligible to retire from the military, and I kind of had to make the decision on what I wanted to do when I grew up. And there was the option of staying and kind of doing the same job, which is the position I'm in. And I spoke to a foreign diplomat who is now a professor and can't go home because they are now persona non grata in their home country. And that individual asked me, are you Superman? Are you going to magically change the world? And that seemed to me really kind of hubristic. And I was like, no, I'm just part of the machine. He's like, well, then you can probably do this work, because I think it is slow and it doesn't move as fast as we want it to. And it's not as receptive as we want it to be. And people get hurt, and we see just some of the worst things. And yet it's still worth continuing to kind of do the incremental steps. I think there is often a belief that the United States can simply snap its fingers and magically things happen. And there are instances where we have outsized influence and we can influence things. And there's also instances where we have not nearly the influence or not nearly the levers available that maybe the population thinks. And so kind of navigating that and thinking through that and thinking through how to do things strategically and intelligently is kind of honestly the work of diplomacy and the work of sort of doing this. And that, absolutely have emotional moments of just feeling awful, right? And just feeling miserable and feeling like we're not moving the ball as much as we want to. And then have the moments where you get a Christmas card from a family that is now resettled. And for those 4 people, that mattered, and that was enough. And so for me, it's the keep pushing. It's trench warfare of like advance 2 inches, lose an inch, advance 2 inches in all of these kind of different contexts, and thinking through what's going to work here, what's going to work now, what's in the realm of the possible, what are the limitations, what are the challenges. I think we have a bunch of good instances where we've tried stuff and it hasn't worked. And how do we learn from that? How do we do that better the next time around? How do we improve our likelihood of success? And thinking through how to do it as efficiently and effectively and with the best usage of resources is kind of that continual work. And so I think there is, from a really good place, right? Like we have to do big now. This is happening. And like, okay, so what's the options? Like, what do we have? And there's often the question of like, when do you have to move forces or things like that? Well, what's the second and third order effects? What happens when those forces are no longer there and they were the only thing sort of maintaining stability? Have you simply just kicked the can down the road and that you're going to have the same problems kind of going forward? And so I think there's a lot of, it's why I think we're so adamant that the prevention side is the better place to do it, because the really kind of like response now, the option sets gets really, really limited. You can't put implementers in danger. You can't sort of get folks to where they want to be. It's unbelievably expensive because of the security requirements and things like that. Whereas in prevention, yeah, we put a bunch of messages on SD cards that they were able to sort of spread out, and it talked about communal agreement over communal virus. And we saw like a marked change in sort of the opinion because folks didn't have cellular service, but they could look at this SD card and it was in their local language. Those kind of programs don't happen in the response phase. That's in the prevention phase. And the toolkit is just so much broader in that upstream prevention space.
We have 2 more questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Request for brief responses, but we want to hear from our colleagues and
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for being here. I think a lot of us have a great level of concern, and in some cases are dissatisfied maybe with the state of affairs happening, especially in the Gaza, but we appreciate your being on the hot seat and answering these questions. My quick question is, there was a ministerial to advance religious freedom that the U.S. State Department hosted in 2017, the inaugural one, which I attended. I was very happy to be there. And I think it ended like in 2020, 2021, may have been the last one. So I was wondering, A, if you knew anything more about those efforts, and if not, that's fine. Within the work and the scope that you do specifically, could you talk more about how religious actors or religious organizations or faith organizations have been helpful in some of the efforts that you've been pursuing?
Yep. So the Office of International Religious Freedom is a partner office under the J Bureau of DRL. It used to be part of DRL, and I have amazing colleagues that are there and doing that work at all times. As far as the ministerial, I actually think we've had ones that have been more recent than the time you gave. I think that continues to happen. It's not my specific area of focus, but I know that they're continuing to do that work. I've joined them on international events, recognizing that obviously religious divisions are often a huge driver of atrocity risk. And so ensuring that we're thinking through that and partnering there is crucial. And so absolutely, they remain a critical component, a critical partner in addressing atrocity risk, and that thinking through how you tamp down religious divisions is a crucial component in thinking through identity-based violence. Yep.
So the last one, in the short time we have left, rather than reading the whole question, could you help us understand a little bit about how it is that it appears oftentimes that the U.S. government focuses on some atrocities and perhaps ignores or even conceals or denies others?
So we have a global remit, right? And we are part of a global system. And the United States interests always will sort of have a part to play. When I'm talking to regional colleagues or embassy colleagues, I often say that I don't expect atrocity prevention to ever be the #1 priority in what they're thinking about. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure that it should be, right? They have to be thinking about the bilateral relationship and security and counterterrorism and economics. There's so many things that they have to be thinking about and balancing. And I have the enviable position of just having to think about one. I just have to be the annoying voice in the room that's like, hey, there's atrocity risk, we should do something. Hey, there's atrocity risk, we should do something. And I just want to make sure I have a seat at the table and get a part to play, and that they recognize that these all happen in concert and that they're thinking through these sort of dynamics. We will always have different levels of engagement based on how we perceive it being in the United States' interest. You brought up Ukraine. I think the fact that that crossed so many different lines of US interest meant that we put a ton amount of energy, effort, resources, et cetera. To say that the other ones are ignored or concealed, I know from at least the constellation of individuals that are working on this as our only problem set, we're thinking about it all the time and trying to drive the needle, right? And trying to move the conversation and trying to make sure that the country processes that happen include our equities, include our work. And that's part of building relationships and making sure I'm viewed as a help and not a hindrance, and that I know who to call and who to reach out to and how the systems work. None of this happens in a vacuum. It all sort of is part of the movement of what is a truly behemoth machine, and knowing where you can touch the lever and move the dial to sort of drive us to a better state is ultimately what my job is. Thank you all.
Thank you.